This is Making Better Decisions. I'm your host, Ryan Sullivan. Decisions are where rubber meets the road for organizations. Each week, we'll be learning from people who are on the front lines of turning raw data into better outcomes for their organizations. This show is sponsored by Canopy Analytic, helping companies make better decisions using data. What is the one thing you wish more people knew about using data to make better decisions?
That is always about having good data. That's the one thing, right? We talk a lot about having a lot of data. We talk a lot about using data. We don't always talk about, is the data that we have actually good? Right? And good means, do we know that it's the right data? Is it authoritative? We're not talking about quality, but just for starters, knowing it's authoritative data is kind of interesting. Because if you think about it, how many times have you been in a scenario people say, well, we could take the data from 4 different places? Maybe you should make up your mind in terms of which one is the authoritative source. So that's my one thing.
Yeah, I love that. I think as somebody who's kind of been a part of a lot of those discussions, right, when we're coming in and either deciding to build some, whether it's warehousing infrastructure, or new reporting initiative, or, advising on strategy for how to decide on KPIs and roll those out to a team, like we do always kind of come back to this question. So I obviously have my own opinions, but I don't want to bias you. What are some suggestions that you might make to someone who's going through that process? Say somebody hears that and they identify with that pain point. What are some suggestions you can have for thinking about, okay, well, how do I pick which four? Do I pick the one that has the number I like the most in it? Or, how do I go about that?
It's a great question. And it's hard to give a short, sweet answer. But I think the short and sweet answer, we'll talk about what that means, is you have to start your lifecycle management of data earlier. When you talk about data warehouses, when you talk about lake houses, when you talk about data fabrics, the conversation usually starts assuming that you have the data and then what you do with it. Okay. You got to push your lifecycle management further left. You actually need to start your lifecycle management with 2 steps before that. The one step is sourcing, right? So if you go back to good old master data management, you spend a lot of time and effort on sourcing the right data. We sort of forgot that as we went into this world of big data and AI. I don't actually think master data management through and through is the right approach, but I do think some of the tools and techniques that allow us to single source data, and I really mean a single source. I only want to have one source of one thing. Some of those techniques you should apply in what I call the sourcing step when I think about the life cycle of data as it throws through to, analytics use. And so in the systems of insight sense, life cycle starts with sourcing. And then the second step, which we tend to also ignore, is ingest, which is actually making sure that I have that good data I decided, which is authoritative source. And now I have it up to date just in raw form. I haven't done anything with it yet, but I've placed the raw data in a place I can do something with. There are so many, different solutions out there to talk about data federation. I have yet to find a solution that does a very good job of doing join in memory. So I still remember when you had to write code that did joins, right? So I know how hard that is, and it's been baked into databases and do a great job of it. But trying to do it in memory is slow and inefficient and usually pretty expensive, right? So this whole thing about there's just something you can't do if you don't move the data. So that's what I would suggest. Add 2 steps to your data lifecycle. Add sourcing explicitly and add ingest explicitly. Move good data to a place that you can manipulate.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. And also my tech nerd brain but that was the tech language version. Many times I don't have the benefit of talking to someone who knows what a join in memory is.
So I should explain that. That's
Yeah.
probably a good idea.
Yeah.
So if you have data from 2 different sources, it is not integrated out of the box. And let's say that you have bits and pieces from one and bits and pieces from the other. And what you really want is a view that looks across. So if you think about what you need to do process wise to make that work, you have to map all the identifying keys from the one source to identifying keys from the other source. The data is probably not going to be in the same order. So somehow you have to mix and match and map these different data pieces together. The
Yeah.
technical language for that is a join. It's a rather complex operation that requires you to understand the totality of the data on the one side, the totality of the data on the other side, and then merge it. And that merge, if it isn't done inside a database, has to be done using some kind of programmatic construct. That's the thing that ends up getting to be expensive.
Yes. Yeah. And in 1 minute there,
I wish that more people knew how much work it takes to get the right base data for whatever you're trying to answer. Because you start a project, you start a new report, you start something new, and the first question is, okay, how do we find out X? And then a whole nother team that you don't even know exists has to go find that data, find it, clean it, create it in a new transformation, come up with new metrics, talk to finance, talk to sales, talk to delivery people. There's all these metrics that seem like they're not that far away, but when you actually have to go find them, they
mm,
they are. And coming from my experience in working in small business, large businesses, some of it's just readily available, and you might already have a team that's ready to provide that for you, but a lot of times it's not. Even if even if it's there in some warehouse, maybe one team says, "Yeah, it's ready to go," and then you go check that with another region or another part of the company, and they say, "Wait a minute, we already have a report and it doesn't match this." So I think that's probably the most important piece of data from my opinion as someone who's,
mm,
a modeler, someone who wants to bring you the data and present it in a way that's useful. That's the most important part. It's not like what do we want to know or 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 how do we get there? It's like, okay, how does someone else help get all these pieces together so that we can finally report on it in a meaningful, valuable way?
yeah. I love that. I think of all of the answers, that's one that lines up with my own personal experience. I think that that has a lot to do with kind of like what my, history was and kind of what the roles that I had were. Like I have also spent a lot of time focused on, building models for other people to use as opposed to just like, here's the window with graphs and stuff on it. I've done that stuff too for sure. But, you know, one of the things that I found was my first job out of college was working for a phone company doing a lot of this kind of stuff. And I would spend pretty much 90% of my time just trying to get all of the data together and make sure that it was clean and make sure that the numbers were right. And then like on Friday afternoon, that extra 10% of time was when I got to do the actual like fun stuff of like digging in and seeing like, okay, well, what's the answer to the question? Can I answer any other cool questions? Like, can I, find us some cool money someplace? Like, whatever the case was, like, it was shocking to me how much of that time got spent. Now, obviously, some of the modern tools that we use can make that a little bit better, but I think all of those depend on the concept of reusability. Like the only place that I have seen where there's actual like material gain to be had on the data cleaning and setup side is when one person cleans it and then another person can either use or improve or whatever that information so that you kind of have this like self-weeding garden, which is essentially a model. Right now, sure, we have ETL logic and all of that stuff, but talk to me a little bit. Like, what is a data model for someone who's not a consultant, and why is it valuable to the business as opposed to just us tech nerds?
I love that analogy, the self-weeding garden. You snuck that right in.
I know.
I like it though. It's a good one. I would start with that with our definition of a model. A model sounds complex. It sounds like some algorithm in the cloud that's determining, what Facebook ad you get or something. But really what it is combination of data using relationships. So, you might have an export from your ERP or your sales platform or your marketing platform that gives you a bunch of what we call transactional data. So it's something happened, uh, someone did it, it happened here, and we can measure it. So it's some sort of value associated with it, whether that's a customer count or sales amount or cost amount or inventory amount. It's just something you can measure, but we define it with what are called either attributes or dimensions in a model sense. So those two words just are descriptions of the data. So we'll have something happened and we want to figure out where, why, how, and what, so that we can either predict what's going to happen next or, make really good observations about what did happen, maybe use
Mhm.
some predictive modeling or AI or machine learning to help us predict what's going to happen next. But at its base level, like it's just a record of what happened, and then the essence of a model is that we use those dimensional fields is what we're called, especially when we're working with, Power BI and this type of interactive reporting. We can say, we have a list of all the stores we have, and that really doesn't change that much, right? Like maybe we open a new one or close one or remodel, but we have a list of those, and maybe you even have that on an Excel sheet on your desktop. It's like, oh,
Yeah.
here's all the new stores we were opening. Um, but if you wanted to bring that into, your transactional data, what we call, wide and Frankensteinish, those really wide tables, maybe you're used to working with them from different uses. But if I want to say, okay, at 10:52 a.m., I had 17 units of inventory, and it happened at this store with this register, and it was this till number, and then it was cloudy, and it was raining. Like you don't need to say that every time at 10:53. You don't need to also say it was cloudy. You don't need to also say it was this till number. So we're able to keep data separate in an efficient way. Like the store really doesn't change that much, and the weather could change, but like I don't need to duplicate it every second that we want to check inventory. So a model lets us like separate out the ideas of what's more static, but describes the data, and then lets us keep a transaction that's really efficient. And we use
Mm.
relationships to say, okay, well, this store number didn't change, but if we want to know who was working and, what the location of that store is and when it opened and what time it closed, like we keep that separate and we can bring it in as we need it in a model. So a model really lets you say, I want to know everything, but I don't want this much data to repeat
Yeah.
itself every time we want to answer that question. So let's as modelers be more efficient in answering those questions, but allowing you as an analyst or an executive or someone that wants to get some insight from that data, lets you still access all that information.
Sure. So I would say in my experience, it is thinking about data as a resource.
Mm.
I think what you very often find, or what I've found in my career, is people think of data in terms of its functionality, right? What can data do for me? Which makes sense because that's, typically people are in for, how am I going to benefit from this thing? And I equate it with, water as a resource. Right, water is a resource. I think we all understand the value of it, right? As human beings in particular, we're mostly made of water. But typically, when we think of water, we think of its functionality, right? I can use it to take a bath, to wash my car, for transport if I'm on a ship. And I think that's the jump people are often struggling to make in their own mind in terms of what data is.
Mm.
Data is a resource which empowers organizations to do so much, and it enables so much functionality to create value for organizations and businesses. But I think that's the thing I've not seen very often in my career.
Mm. Yeah. I think is this kind of transition from thinking about it reactively to proactively, as opposed to how can this kind of, answer this one question that I have, to more of a, we have all this information. How can it guide us to a better future?
Yeah, I totally agree, right? It's thinking about the foundation of what you're trying to achieve as an organization and what's the role of data. And in today's day and age, data is literally the lifeblood of everything any organization's trying to do, whether they're
Mm,
already kind of a fully digital company or whether they're a traditional or legacy company trying to transition into the digital space.
mm,
But I think to your point, what's more common is we have a very specific and particular use case. And
mm.
so we need to bring data into the ecosystem of the organization to facilitate that use case being delivered because the people making decisions about the business think that use case being executed is going to generate business value.
Yeah. I think as I hear you talk about that, it kind of rings some bells with some conversations that I've had in the past around strategy and data strategy and kind of just using data. I've had a lot of conversations with people, not so much on the podcast. Most of the folks on the podcast are pretty turned on, they're leaders in data already. Um, but I think one of the things that I find is there's this idea of, okay, well, we know that moving into a more digital future is something that's going to benefit the business. There's hints to that everywhere. And so there's this, I think, well-intentioned drive to, okay, well, we're going to build a data strategy. We're going to figure out what does data mean to our organization, and we're going to go do it. And while I think that's really well intentioned, one of the pitfalls that I see there is sometimes doing something data or technically oriented really for its own sake, as opposed to thinking about what is the business's strategy? What are the goals of this organization? And how can we use the resources, data, and the tools that we use to interact with it as tools to help us get there? So, one of the things that I said in your introduction is that you're pretty good at figuring out how to meld those two pieces of strategy. What is the business's overall strategy? And then how is data strategy a part of that? For someone who's in that transition and trying to kind of improve the maturity of how their organization uses and understands data, what are some recommendations for making sure that they're aligned and they're not spending time on projects that are kind of cool and technical, but may not directly impact their business goals?
Yeah, no, it's funny. My kids ask me all the time, what do I actually do for a living? And this is it. This is the thing I actually do, right? So you're right. Every organization I worked for has had this gap, I'll call it,
Mm,
between what are the business objectives, strategically, what's the business trying to accomplish, and how do you fish the data out to enable those initiatives? For me, I would say probably the most important thing is creating prioritization at the top of the organization, right?
mm,
Kind of any endeavor, if there's not buy-in at the top, it's going to be very hard to drive change throughout the organization, right? So getting your executives, your senior leaders on board with this idea of becoming a data informed organization, what's the actual value of doing that? Right. And then starting down the path of prioritizing what are the business's top one, two, three objectives for the year. I think
yeah,
that's a very good way to start providing focus on now how do you start cultivating a business strategy which aligns with the data strategy that you can
yeah,
execute, right? Rather than having them in, two siloed pieces like all the technical people are talking about, well, here's the architecture we can build based on the systems and based on the ingestion and the ETL and the blah, blah, blah. And it's like, that's amazing technical work. But if you
yeah,
can't drive it to the business piece and vice versa, the business wants to achieve an objective and they think moving into the digital age and driving data forward into the organization is going to help, but they may not have the data they need to actually answer the business questions they're trying to answer to move forward. So that's the gap, right? It's really about educating the senior business leaders and getting them on the same page in terms of what business priorities are. Then I think now you're able to go back and start strategizing at a data level in terms of what
yeah.
work can you prioritize and execute.
That's a good one to start off with. And what I what I think people need to focus a little bit more on is not to get too bogged down with having the perfect data. See, at the end of the
Mm,
day, it is about making decisions, right? Uh, we need data for decisions, and depending on what you want to do, you're never going to have 100% or a complete data set that you need to make the perfect decision, right? So, what we need to know is how do we make it good enough? Because when we are in in the today's business environment, things need to move really, really fast, right? And there's a lot of time where we see that how quickly you react to things is better than making the perfect decisions, right? So that in that sense of innovation doesn't need to slow down for the perfect data, and that's what I think people need to keep in mind.
yeah, I love that. You know, when I first started my career, um, I was doing financial performance and analysis, FP&A for all of those finance pros in the know. Um, and that was kind of one of the things that I was really struck by is there's this concept of total optimization that took me a little time to learn. So when I started, it's kind of like, all right, well, I'm focused on this piece of the puzzle. How can I make this the most optimal possible? But it's like if the amount of time, effort, and energy that it takes me to optimize this is less than the return that I get, well, then I should just not do that. And so it's, as you mentioned, kind of really thinking about the bigger picture. And if you're in a landscape where speed is much more valuable than, one unit of speed is more valuable than an incremental unit of accuracy, well, that's a good decision. And that's not something that you hear very often in the data world, right? Like there's this assumption that every piece of data needs to be 100% accurate, right? So it's really thinking about the business goals and the trade-off with all of that stuff. I think that one of the things that a lot of organizations interact with is this idea of figuring out which of those things are important. So, what advice would you give to an organization to try and figure out, okay, well, what is the right amount of effort that we should put into this to make sure that it's as accurate as it needs to be, but is also getting out the door quickly enough?
Yeah, so again, I think what we as data professional and what organizations focus on already and should continue to focus on is data quality, right?
Mm,
And data quality depends on your use case. The same data may be a bad quality data for a particular use case, and it may be a good quality data for another use case, right?
mm,
For looking at, you know, uh, a business performance, we look at highly aggregated numbers, right? It doesn't matter if a couple of records in there, and you've been in FP&A. If the errors are below the level of materiality, it doesn't matter. But
mhm.
the same use case for the same data set, if you're using the same data set to send out letters to your customers to get back the money, if you do not have the right records there, even there's a minor difference in the balances, the same data then becomes the bad quality data, right? So what needs to be focused on is making sure that organizations have the right quality of data for the use case that they are aiming for. And for each one of them, there would be at some point diminishing returns in getting the perfect data set.
Yeah. Yeah, I absolutely love that. And those were also I would argue kind of perfect examples for it. Um so one of the things that is really interesting about getting to do the podcast is I get to talk to people with a lot of different types of backgrounds. And, obviously the common thread is that everybody's kind of, a data professional believes in the value of data, has, certain technical aptitude to be able to create or understand analytics. I also love digging into the things that everybody is different on. So one of the things that I think you really bring to the table is that kind of consulting and financial background. So what would you say are some of the unique aspects of generating, financial reporting, and what are some of the challenges and the things that are different about financial reporting versus any other type of reporting?
Oh, how it is different, I'd have to probably give it a thought, but some of the things that I think are absolutely essential in financial reporting is trust. Somebody
Mm,
who's looking at your financial reports, whether it is within inside the organization for your performance metrics or outside the organization for your statutory reporting, trust is the central pillar. So anything that you say in a financial report needs to be backed uh, by an auditable record of whatever you're saying.
mm,
That is one. The second thing I think that which is really, really essential is to make it really easy for people to understand, right? As if we delve into different types of reporting for different people, uh, it can end up being very technical and niche to a particular subject area. And especially when we talk about financial numbers or financial reports, they're used by all types of people, right? Uh, Outside the finance organization, within a company, within an organization as well. I'll give you an example. Uh, I think a few years ago, maybe like 7, 8 years ago, uh, I went into a meeting with a business VP and his entire staff, and we were discussing financial performance. And I started talking about, okay, here's the forecast. This is how far we are from our target. And as I read the room, I could feel like there's like something missed, like, that suddenly everybody was very quiet. So I just asked, like, hey, do you understand what I'm talking about? Because I'm right now talking about forecast and target, and these are two different things. And then we came to a point where everybody was like, we don't really understand this. And I
mm.
went into that meeting thinking about, oh, these are business people. They must be talking about these numbers every single day. So I was going into that meeting with my own bias that everything that I talk about in finance is going to be understandable by every person. So I think keeping it simple in finance to understanding that it is going to be viewed by people who do not understand finance is important. So going back, I think trust is really important in financial reporting.
Mm.
Auditability is really important. And the third thing is making it simple and understanding that people beyond the finance world are also going to look at it.
That's a wrap for today's episode of Making Better Decisions. For show notes and more, visit makingbetterdecisions.live. A special thank you to our sponsor, Canopy Analytic. Canopy Analytic is a boutique consultancy focused on business intelligence and data engineering. They help companies make better decisions using data. For more information, visit canopyanalytic.com. There's a better way. Let's find it together and make better decisions. Thank you so much for listening. We'll catch you next week. Peace.